everyone. Today I'm going to show you how you can recast your steel tang axes. This is DIY with MalaMaker. Hey everyone, MalaMaker here, and today I'm going to walk you through recasting steel tang axe handles. Now, you might ask yourself, why would I want to recast a steel tang axe handle? Well, this particular axe that we're going to be working with today is a common axe that's found in the axe throwing world, especially if you have axe throwing lanes that maybe you open to the public for reserve and stuff like that. This might be a familiar sight to you where the end of the handle's all beat up, you've got it taped up, but the axe itself is really still in good shape. Really the only thing that needs tending to is the handle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the process of stripping the axe down to what we have here, where the axe is stripped down of all the rubber or most of the rubber, cleaned up, and then we are actually going to recast the axe handle, and I'm going to show you how to do it, what products to use, and the process in which to do it to get an excellent result. Now, before we begin with prepping the handle for casting and actually casting the new handle, let's go through some of the tools and supplies necessary to make this project possible. All the details of the tools and supplies you need can be found in a link in the description below that'll give you step-by-step instructions, just like this video, on how to complete this project, and links to all the various places to get the supplies necessary to recast your handle. Now, the base of the handle is a urethane rubber, which we're going to be using, and for this handle, we have tested and validated that VitaFlex, Smooth-On's VitaFlex 50 and 60 urethane rubbers are the correct rubber to use for this application. Also, we are going to need mold release to actually be able to release what we pour and cure in the molds when it's done. We have our mold itself. We have non-hardening clay. We have cups necessary to complete the project. Typically with the cups, you only need 2 small cups and 1 large cup. Ultimately, you're going to pour your 2 parts of your urethane rubber in separate cups and then combine them together. But for the sake of this particular pour, I'm actually going to be doing 2 colors, so I need actually double the cups that I normally would need. I have a gram scale. I have a utility knife. I have cut-resistant gloves. I have a respirator for when we actually pour and mix and pour the urethane rubbers. And I have, for my tools, I have a driver with a 6mm bit, but you can also use an Allen wrench in that place to ultimately clamp the mold together. And there'll be other various tools that we'll use throughout the project, but these are the core tools that you need to get going. All right, so now we are ready to start stripping down our axe handle to ultimately take the axe from this to this. So what we're first going to want to do is we're going to take, obviously, safety precautions and wear our cut-resistant gloves. So I'm going to put my gloves on, and then as we strip down this axe, there's really not a true science to stripping down the rubber. It's going to take a little bit of cutting with cutting the rubber, and ultimately just taking pure strength and just peeling off the rubber as you go and stripping areas that you feel necessary to strip. Really, other than that, there's really not a set way of doing it, and every axe handle is a little bit different and when you go to strip it down. Now, the rubber that I have left on here is well attached, so pretty much what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on getting the remaining of the rubber off from around the neck. And to do that, pretty much what you're going to do is you're going to grab a steel brush and you're going to brush that remaining rubber off from around the neck, because really what you want is one, if you're going for a different color, you don't want the blue of this handle is blue, you don't want the blue to show through. So if you clean it off, but also if you get clean steel, it's going to attach, the urethane rubber is going to attach to the steel a lot better. So take a steel brush, brush it down. You can also take a wire wheel to this and wire wheel the rest of this off if you want to get it down to the bare casting for the axe. But we've stripped down the axe handle. It's nice and cleaned up. For the most part, I might do a little bit of more cleanup offline on this one, but this is the bare minimum that you'll need to make sure that this axe is ready for casting. So we just finished stripping down our axe handle, and now we're at a point where we're ready to start prepping this handle for casting. So to start off with this process, what we're going to need to do is take our mold and actually apply mold release to the mold, so that when the mold is actually cracked open when the casting is done, the mold breaks free clearly and the mold is able to be reused. So first what we're going to do is we're going to grab nitrile gloves, or a glove that is suitable for the type of skin that you have, if you do have any sensitivities. So we're going to take disposable gloves and we're going to put them on. All right, got my gloves on. The other thing I'm going to need is my mask, because I will be spraying an aerosol. You're going to want to use your mask when you're applying your mold release and you have vapors in the air. Once the vapors are gone, you can take it off, at least for a time being, but then you're also going to want to use the mask for when you are pouring the urethane rubber as well. Another thing to make note is my area does have active ventilation. I have a ventilation fan up here that vents outside. So I do have proper ventilation for the room that I'm in. All right, so our mold is sprayed. Now, when I sprayed the mold, I focused on main areas that ultimately I'm not going to be able to reach when this mold is strapped around the handle. So what I focused on was obviously the interior of the mold, the face of the mold, and then I also did the actual the pore locations and the vent holes as well, because once I have this mounted on the axe, the handle itself I'm going to want to do, or sorry, the tang itself, I'm going to want to make sure that I have no mold release on it, because I want that urethane rubber to attach to this tang. So I want to make sure that this is clean and clear and ready to be able to have the urethane rubber actually attached to it. So saying that, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take isopropyl alcohol and actually spray this down and take a paper towel and wipe down to just get this clear of any residues that that I might have gotten on it, or just for whatever residuals for maybe the original manufacturing process. And what I'm gonna do is spray it down, take a paper towel, kind of wipe it off, and pretty much that's it. All right, so we have sprayed mold release on the interior parts of our mold. I also offline sprayed mold release on the Allen key to make sure that it had mold release on it as well. This is the 3mm Allen key that does come with the mold. And then also cleaned up the axe handle to make sure there's clear of any potential residues on that would ultimately cause the urethane rubber to not adhere to the steel tang of the axe. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually assemble the mold together with the axe, and I'm going to take you through that process. So first, what you're going to want to do is take one half of your mold and set the other half aside. You're going to then take the Allen key, and from the back part of the mold, you're going to push the Allen key through. Now, this Allen key is used as a locator for locating the little hole in the bottom of the axe within the mold to kind of hold it in its rightful place, and then ultimately between that locator and the neck of the axe itself, it holds the axe in the proper location. So we have the Allen key through the back of the mold. Then we're going to take a spacer, which also is something that comes with the mold itself. We're going to thread that over the Allen key as well. Now, when you do pour this mold, that spacer is something that will get left in the urethane rubber. So that is a sacrificial piece to ultimately hold the axe where it needs to be, and it'll just stay within the mold, and there'll be enough urethane rubber around it that it'll ultimately contain it through the life of the mold, or through the life of the handle. So we now have the spacer on there, and now what we're going to do is we're going to take the axe in the proper location, and we are going to actually thread the whole of the axe down the Allen key, and we're going to want to press the neck into the mold a little bit, just loosely. And now the axe is actually set into the one half of the mold, and the spacer itself is set up in a way that ultimately that hole is just large enough that the spacer will fit in the middle of that hole. Now, what you're going to then want to do is take the other half of the mold, and you're going to want to locate it over that Allen key again, pushing the Allen key out, and then ultimately putting the other, one of my timers, putting the other half of the mold over the axe. So now we've pre-assembled the mold without obviously clamping anything together, but we've pre-assembled kind of all the loose pieces, and now we're at a point where we're ready to put the bolts through the mold and ultimately clamp everything down. All right, so now that we're ready to clamp down the mold and we've got everything kind of roughly, loosely pre-assembled, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the M8 button head cap screws that come with the mold, and what we're gonna do is thread from the bottom side. We're gonna start threading a couple bolts through the mold, mainly to hold this thing together loosely to begin with. And what we're going to do is put a washer on each bolt, take a wing nut, start a wing nut on each bolt, and I actually will, here in a second, once I get the wing nut on here, flip this and actually use my driver with the proper Allen insert on that and actually drive this down loosely, so then I can ultimately assemble the rest of the bolts together and kind of orient it in how I see fit. All right, now that I got the 2 bolts tightened in there to kind of hold things there, I'm actually going to take the axe stand that comes with the mold kit, and I'm going to put the axe in the axe stand to kind of hold it up to make it a little bit easier to put the bolts in, and then I'm just going to go through and put all the rest of the bolts into the mold. Now, when you are putting the bolts into the mold and actually tightening the mold down, you want to be very careful to tighten things down as evenly as you possibly can and not over tighten the bolts, because if you do over tighten the bolts, you will tighten it in a way that ultimately will deform the plastic in the mold if you do not have the clamping plates. The mold itself is resin and plastic, so you can break the mold if you aren't being attentive to the clamp pressure that you're applying on the mold. Now, if you do have the clamping plates, the chances are greatly reduced. The clamping plates ultimately give ultimately an aluminum plate on both sides that the bolts will ultimately, the heads of the bolt and the washers will rest up against, and ultimately it'll apply an even pressure over the mold and actually will prolong the life of your mold overall. So just to kind of show you what I'm doing, I'm literally just placing the washers over the bolts. And what I'm going to do is put the wing nuts on. And now that I've got the wing nuts started, I'm going to take my driver and tighten everything down. Now, you can also use an Allen key to do this same thing. I just want to do this a little quicker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zigzag my way down, doing the tops and ultimately skipping a row, going down the opposite side, and just ultimately zigzagging my way down, crossing over and zigzagging my way back up. And then I'll do the same thing again, zigzagging my way down and zigzagging my way back up to ultimately try and apply as even of a pressure as I can over the whole mold as I tighten things down. All right, so I've gotten all the bolts tightened down, all snugged up. You will notice that the gap on the side will have reduced, and you shouldn't really see many, if any, gap on the sides of the mold. About the only place you might see any gap at all is a very tiny gap that you'll see potentially up here around where you're going to pour your resin in, or sorry, your urethane rubber in. All right, so we've tightened down the bolts evenly, crisscrossing as we tighten. Now you'll notice that the seam along the side has ultimately collapsed together to where you ultimately have a very narrow seam that's left. Now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to take our soft clay and apply it around the neck of the base of the mold to ultimately seal up any potential leaks that might occur. That is actually the one place on this mold where if you have any potential of really leaking heavily is at the base of the mold. So ultimately what we're going to do is press the clay in, get it good and pressed into place to ultimately just reduce any locations where that urethane rubber can leak out. All right, so we've got the clay applied there, and now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to put our mask on again and ultimately spray down the mold. And what we're mainly going to focus on here is kind of spraying around the base of the mold just in case there's any drips that drip down here, because anywhere that urethane rubber touches that ultimately there's not mold release, the potential of it coming off is a lot more difficult. So we want to really kind of get the mold release applied anywhere we can. You don't have to be super generous with it, but you just want to make sure you touch all the key areas that will ultimately have the rubber. Another key place to focus on is ultimately down the sides of the mold where the seam is on both sides. And then if this is one of your first times doing it, make sure you just get all the sides until you really figure out where that urethane rubber is going to go once it's poured. I would also advise the faces too, because you might get a run or two that come out of the locator pin. Okay, so we've applied mold release, we've sealed up our mold, and we've got our mold all fully assembled here. So now we are at the point where we are ready to start allocating out our Vitaflex urethane rubber to ultimately pour into this mold. Now, the type of urethane rubber that I'm using today is the Vitaflex 60. The difference between the 50 and 60 is really from the original hardness of the handle. 50 is a little bit softer, 60 is maybe a little bit harder or right on where the handle is. So really it kind of all depends on your preference. You can get samples of the Vitaflex rubber either through your local smooth-on distributor, or you can also order handle samples that ultimately one handle is poured in the low res mold using the Vitaflex 50, and the other handle that's provided is a high res mold poured in the Vitaflex 60. So you can ultimately see what the handles are. This handle doesn't have a core in it, but the samples do come with ultimately a simulation core in them, so you can ultimately get an idea of the feel of the handle with a simulation core inside, just like you would have the Tang of the X. All right, so now that we are ready to pour our urethane rubber, what we're going to want to do is we're going to grab our gram scale, and what we're looking for here is a 200 gram total weight of the Vitaflex urethane rubber that you are going to want to pour between ultimately the 50 and 60. Normally in the instructions it says you need ultimately 3 cups, 2 small, 1 large. I am doing something a little bit different today, where ultimately I'm actually pouring 2 different colors, so I need double the cups to ultimately get those 2 different colors. Really with the mold, what I'm doing is one half of the mold will be red, the other half of the mold will be green, and they kind of hopefully will create kind of a swirl in the middle, or just a really cool mixture up through the mold. So fingers crossed that works. We'll see. It's going to be just kind of playing around with it to do something fun with this mold that I pour. But ultimately we're looking for 200 total grams. Make sure before you pour, you read the instructions on your Vitaflex urethane rubber to make sure that you take all the proper precautions, and then also mix it in the proper quantities that's listed. On the box of the Vitaflex, it does say to mix 1 to 1 by volume, but on the bottles it is a little bit different, where it says 1 to 1 by both weight or volume. So based on what I'm seeing is I can do it based on weight or volume. So I'm going to do it by weight. So I'm going to pour out my mold. I'm going to zero out I'm going to get ready to pour everything out. I'm going to pour my A's first. If you aren't familiar with the process and which one is A and which one is B, take a Sharpie, mark your cups of which one's A and which one's B. Prior to actually mixing them together, you're going to want to keep them separate. Once you combine them together, the clock starts ticking of getting that actual urethane rubber into the mold. All right, so I'm ready to pour. I'm grabbing my part A, turning on my scale. I recommend wearing a mask when pouring this. Because I'm doing this video, I'm not gonna wear a mask, but I do have ventilation here to offset not wearing a mask. So what I'm gonna do is I've zeroed out my scale, I have it set on grams, and ultimately what I'm doing is I'm looking for a total of 100 grams of the VitaFlex Part A for my particular pour in 2 cups. But if you're doing a single color or you're just doing a single pour, you're gonna just do it in 1 cup of the Part A. All right, I've poured 100 grams, which is roughly about 5 ounces of urethane rubber. So if you did have like a 5.5 ounce cup, you could ultimately roughly guess what 5 ounces is. And since you can do this by both weight and volume, you could ultimately do this by volume and not actually need a scale. So I'm gonna pour for my particular, what I'm measuring out here, another 100 grams, but this time Part B. And like I said before, wear a respirator. This does have an odor. It does recommend in the instructions to wear a respirator, but I do have a very strong exhaust system in here that ultimately I can actually hardly smell the smell of the urethane resin. Not that that really is a good indicator, but I am taking at least some precautions, but due to the making of the video, I'm having to kind of not wear the mask so that I can actually talk. So now at this point, we've measured out our Part A and Part B. I'm gonna set aside my Part A for now, and now what I'm gonna do is, if you are planning on mixing in colorants, now is the time to do it. And this is where ultimately you're gonna mix in your colorants into your Part B of your urethane rubber Part A, Part B side. So the Part B side is ultimately what you're gonna focus on. And the 2 colors I'm gonna make today are red and black. Now, with doing the color mixing, you will need to play around with the colors. I am gonna come out with a kind of a mix chart to ultimately give you good ideas of what color equals ultimately how many drops of colorant of the So Strong colorant. All right, now that we've mixed our colors together, we are now ready to combine the Part A and Part B together into our larger cup and actually mix those together to actually do the pour. Now, prior to mixing them in the cup, please remember that you have a 60-minute pot life, meaning that you have 60 minutes to get that urethane rubber both mixed and in the mold. All right, so we're ready to combine the Part A and Part B together. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to pour the Part A into the cup, and I don't care really at this point if I cross-contaminate because I'm gonna be pouring the Part B here in shortly. So I'm gonna pour the Part A, scrape the cup, get it cleaned out. All right, there's the Part A. Now I'm gonna combine in the Part B. And now I have 60 minutes, which should give me more than enough time to get this mixed up thoroughly, get the sides scraped, and get it ready to pour in, and actually be able to do both colors as well. So what I'm gonna do is, since I'm already here, I'm gonna mix my Part A and Part B together of my red. And you can see I have a nice brilliant red there. I'm gonna mix the parts together, scraping the sides, scraping the bottom, and really kind of getting that those Part A and Part B's mixed together thoroughly. Now when I do pour this, it's going to be a little trickier than normal because I do have two different colors. When I pour the two parts, even if I was only pouring the two colors, if I were pouring one color, I do it the same way, but ultimately I'm going to be pouring in an elevated height above the mold and ultimately trying to stretch the urethane rubber as it pours to kind of stretch and dissipate any bubbles I possibly can. This urethane rubber is designed to where really you don't need to do degassing or kind of put this in a vacuum chamber is kind of another way to explain it. For this particular example, I'm not showing you the degassing because I really want to show you what most people are going to have when they do this, which is not have a vacuum chamber. So show you what it's like without a vacuum chamber. But if you do have the means to a vacuum chamber, by all means use it. Dissipate as many bubbles as you possibly can out of that urethane rubber before you pour it. Okay, so I have both my parts. Now I'm going to pour. This is something I forgot to tell everybody in the beginning of the video, is I am going to grab a little bit more of my soft clay, and I am actually going to set the soft clay in kind of at the base of the axe handle. And what I'm going to do is set a small cup down here to ultimately catch any drips that come ultimately from the air vents of the mold. All right, our mold has sat for 16 hours, and now we're ready to demold our casting. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is obviously remove all the bolts, and then once we remove all these bolts out of the mold, then from there we're going to use some tools to ultimately pry it open. But we just want to make sure that we're careful when we do pry this open as to not damage the mold. So now, before I actually pull the mold apart, what I'm going to do is try and do my best to remove the locator pin. What I'm going to do with that is probably grab a pair of pliers to kind of work that out. The reason why you use an Allen wrench for this is, one, you can spin it to kind of, you can ultimately have an arm to kind of spin it to loosen it up in the mold, and then also something to grab onto as you remove it out. But nice little Allen wrench works as a locator on this. So now is the fun part. Turned out a little bit different than I expected, but still a great cast. Oh, this is so cool. This is really, really cool. I'll flip. This side is really cool, and then this one, this side is really, really neat as well, with how the colors ran in here. So I'm super, super stoked. I've never done the two color pour before, so you guys got to see, the reaction in real time.
So now that we have it out of its, we ultimately have it to a point where it's out of the mold. I can pull the clay off, and now what we're going to do is just snip off ultimately the sprue and your vent holes. Literally what I'm going to do is take a pair of side cutters and literally just do snip snip, and then this one you're probably going to need to snip on one side, flip it around, snip it on the other, and yep. With the amount of, with 200 grams of urethane rubber, this is about what you have left over. Another thing to note too is on the bottom here, if you do not degas it, you might get a little bit of micro bubbling here. It's just an aesthetic thing. It's not going to actually hurt the integrity of the handle, but now you have poured a handle. The only other additional thing that you may want to do is if you want to ultimately trim out any of the flashing here around the where the neck is, you might have gotten a little bit of like urethane rubber that kind of went onto the actual neck. Just a razor blade or an X-Acto knife to trim that off, and then ultimately to clean off any of the flashing, you can literally take a fingernail and clean that off. Another thing you're going to want to do as well is to get all the kind of mold release and things like that off of this. Take isopropyl alcohol, spray it down, wipe it down, and that'll clean most of that up. So that is it. You have now poured yourself an axe handle using molds and urethane rubber, and this is the result. I'll have some videos following here that'll show you an actual casted handle being used at a lane. So anyways, I'm MalaMaker. Thank you for joining me on this DIY with MalaMaker, and I hope you guys have a great time recasting your handles. If you have any questions or have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And definitely subscribe to the channel, as I do like doing a whole bunch of these DIY and how-to videos. So anyways, happy making. See you later.